most disturbing snowfall horror stories. The first snowfall of winter transformed White Hollow into a serene, snow-covered dream. The streets, rooftops, and trees were buried under thick layers of white. It was so quiet, unnaturally quiet. For the townsfolk, it was just another winter night. But for Irene Lawson, who had moved into the secluded cottage on the outskirts, it was a night that would change her life forever. The old cottage had a name: the Whispering Hearth. Irene thought it was charming, quaint even, but the townsfolk had been strange about it. "It's peaceful," the grocer had said with an uneasy laugh, "but sometimes peace ain't all it seems." She had brushed it off. City life had left her exhausted, craving solitude. And tonight, as the storm raged outside, Irene was tucked in her cozy living room by the fire, a cup of tea in hand. The wind howled, battering the windows with snow. She sighed, her body sinking into the soft cushions. Then, she heard it. At first it was faint, almost like the wind was carrying whispers through the storm. She sat up slightly, straining to hear. Nothing. Her heartbeat slowed, and she let out a soft chuckle. "You're imagining things," she muttered, shaking her head. But the sound came again, a murmur, low, steady. Words she couldn't quite make out. She froze, her breath hitching. The tea in her hands trembled, rippling slightly in the cup. Slowly she set it down and stood, her eyes scanning the room. "Is someone there?" Her voice broke the silence, trembling slightly. Nothing. Her gaze drifted toward the window. The frost had blurred the view, but she thought she saw movement outside, just a flicker of shadow. She stepped closer, her breath fogging the glass. Then, a single knock. Sharp, deliberate. Her body jolted. She stumbled back, her heart thundering in her chest. "Who's out there?" she called, louder this time, her voice shaky. Silence. Then the whispering came again, louder now. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't her imagination. It was a voice. Her knees felt weak as she backed away from the window. "This is crazy," she muttered. "Just the storm. It's just the storm." The lights flickered. The room plunged into darkness for a split second before the lights returned, dimmer now. The fire sputtered weakly, and the air grew cold, so cold she could see her breath misting in front of her. And then, footsteps. They were deliberate, slow, heavy. Her stomach churned as she turned toward the hallway where the sound was coming from. The door was ajar. She was sure she'd closed it earlier. A lump formed in her throat. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Who's there?" No response. The shadows seemed to thicken, pooling in the corners of the room, creeping along the walls. The fire flickered again, casting strange shapes that danced and twisted in unnatural ways. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling so badly she nearly dropped it. Her breaths were shallow, each one catching in her throat. Then the knock came again. This time, it was louder. Her head snapped toward the window. A shadow moved past, too fast to be human. Her phone clattered to the floor. Her voice cracked as she shouted, "What do you want?" The whispering stopped. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on her like a weight. And then, with an icy gust, the fire went out completely. The darkness was absolute. Her pulse roared in her ears as she fumbled for her phone. From the hallway came a creak, slow, prolonged, like someone stepping carefully, deliberately. Her breathing hitched. She wanted to run, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. Her body trembled as she forced herself to move toward the hallway. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her heart stopped when she saw it. At the far end of the hallway, near the staircase, a shadow moved. It wasn't the kind of shadow cast by light. This was darker, almost solid. Her voice wavered. "Who are you?" What do you want?" The figure tilted its head as if studying her. It raised an arm and pointed toward the window. Her blood ran cold. Slowly, as if compelled, she turned her head. The frost on the glass had melted in strange patterns. They weren't random. They looked like handprints, and beyond the glass, faint shapes moved in the storm. At first, she thought it was just the wind swirling the snow. But no. They were figures, dozens of them, motionless, watching. Her chest tightened. Her breaths came in ragged gasps. The whispering grew louder, filling her ears, her head, her entire being. "Leave me alone!" she screamed, her voice cracking. The whispering stopped. The stillness was deafening. Then, from the hallway, a door creaked open. She turned back. The front door was wide open, snow swirling into the house. A sharp chill gripped her. She didn't think, she just ran. Grabbing her coat, she bolted out into the storm, the freezing wind stinging her face. Snow clung to her boots, slowing her every step, but she didn't dare stop. Behind her, the whispers returned, louder than ever, chasing her through the night. She glanced back, just once, and wished she hadn't. The figures were following her. Their shapes flickered, moving unnaturally fast through the snow, their forms shifting and blending with the storm. Irene's legs burned, her lungs screaming for air, but she kept running. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep going. But no matter how far she ran, the whispering was always there. It was inside her head now, clawing at her sanity. And as the storm swallowed her whole, she realized one horrifying truth. She was never truly alone. This is Most Scary Snowfall Horror Story number 2. The first snowfall of the season blanketed the small mountain town of Hollow Ridge, turning it into a serene winter wonderland. Snowflakes fell gently, layering trees, rooftops, and roads with a pristine white sheen. For most of the town's residents, the storm was a signal for cozy nights by the fire, warm drinks, and quiet serenity. But for Eleanor, it was different. She stood by her window, gazing out at the storm as an unease settled deep in her chest. It wasn't the cold or the isolation of her hilltop home that unnerved her. It was the silence. A silence so dense, it felt alive. Eleanor had moved to Hollow Ridge months ago, hoping to escape the noise of city life. Her new home, nestled among tall pines, had promised peace. But as the snowstorm thickened outside, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her evening was interrupted by an unexpected call. The phone's sharp ring shattered the heavy quiet, jolting her. Frowning, she glanced at the screen. An unfamiliar number. Who could be calling her at this hour? Against her better judgment, she answered. "Hello?" At first, there was nothing but static, a faint, crackling hum that made her grip the phone tighter. And then, a whisper. "Don't let them in." The words were faint, barely audible, but they sent a chill racing down her spine. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The line went dead. For a long moment, Eleanor just stood there, staring at the phone in her hand. Her pulse roared in her ears. Was it a prank? A wrong number? She tried to dismiss it, but the voice felt real. Hours later, as the storm raged on, Eleanor prepared for bed. She checked the locks on every door and window, triple-checking the heavy wooden front door. The wind howled outside, rattling the glass panes like an unseen force trying to get in. She climbed into bed, wrapping herself in her thickest blanket. Still, she couldn't shake the unease. The sound of the wind seemed to carry something with it, faint whispers that faded as soon as she strained to hear them. And then she noticed it. Footprints. From her bedroom window, she saw them, clear and distinct, leading from the tree line to her porch. Her stomach dropped. She hadn't heard anyone approach. Surely she would have noticed. Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She dialed the sheriff's office, her voice cracking as she explained what she saw. "We'll send someone out as soon as we can," the deputy assured her. "The roads are bad with the storm, but stay inside and keep your doors locked." She hung up, clutching the phone tightly, but the unease only deepened. She retreated to her room, locked the door, and sat on her bed, staring at the window. The first knock came just after midnight. It was soft, barely a sound. Thud, thud. Her breath caught in her throat. The sound was deliberate, hesitant, almost polite. But in the stillness of the night, it was deafening. She slid out of bed, heart pounding in her chest, and crept toward the top of the stairs. "Who's there?" she called, her voice shaking. There was no answer, no movement. But then, a whisper. Faint and chilling, it seemed to echo all around her. "Let us in." Eleanor's blood ran cold. She couldn't pinpoint where the voice came from. It wasn't at the door. It was everywhere. She stumbled back to her room, locking herself in and grabbing the heavy flashlight from her nightstand. Her hands shook as she dialed the sheriff's office again, but this time, no signal. Her phone screen flickered, and the room seemed to grow colder. She glanced at the clock on her wall. It was frozen at 11:47 p.m. The whispers grew louder. "You can't hide from us. We're waiting." She pressed her hands to her ears, but it was no use. The voices were inside her head, burrowing deeper with every second. Then, the power went out. Darkness enveloped the house. Only her flashlight remained, casting flickering beams across the walls. She aimed it at the window, praying she wouldn't see anything, but she did. Figures stood in the snow, pale and unmoving, their outlines blurred by the storm. They weren't shaped like people, at least not entirely. Their forms wavered, as if they weren't solid. Eleanor stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. Its beam rolled across the floor, illuminating shadows that twisted unnaturally on the walls. The voices grew frantic now, louder and more insistent. "Let us in." "You're alone, Eleanor?" She couldn't breathe. Her chest felt tight, and the air around her seemed to thrum with unseen energy. And then, a crash. The sound of shattering glass echoed from downstairs. She screamed, scrambling for the fireplace poker she had left near her bed. With shaking hands, she gripped it tightly and crept toward the door. The whispers were no longer outside. They were inside. She made her way to the attic, the only place left to hide. The stairs creaked beneath her weight, each sound amplified in the oppressive silence. She pulled the door shut behind her and pressed her back against it, gripping the poker so tightly her knuckles turned white. The attic was dark, filled with the scent of old wood and dust. Shadows danced in the corners, shifting with every flicker of her failing flashlight. The voices followed her. "You'll never escape. Why won't you let us in?" Her breath came in shallow gasps. She swung the poker at the darkness, desperate to defend herself against something she couldn't see. Cold air brushed the back of her neck. She spun around, heart hammering, but there was nothing there. Nothing. The first light of dawn broke through the attic window. Eleanor blinked, her body trembling with exhaustion. The whispers were gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. She made her way downstairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The house was quiet now, too quiet. The snow outside glistened under the morning sun, untouched. The footprints she had seen the night before were gone, erased by the storm. But as she looked closer, her breath caught in her throat. At the edge of the woods, barely visible through the trees, stood a figure. It didn't move, it didn't leave, it only watched. Eleanor backed away from the window, her pulse racing. She knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. The snowstorm might have passed, but its quiet wasn't peace. It was a promise, and they would return. This is Most Creepy Snowfall Horror Story number 3. Rebecca Martin wasn't the type to believe in legends. She was a photojournalist, pragmatic and driven. She wasn't easily swayed by tall tales or the eerie whispers of old folk stories. So when she found herself in Silver Hollow, a small, isolated mountain town blanketed in a thick, unyielding snowfall, it was for work, not folklore. The storm outside was relentless. The snow fell in heavy, almost suffocating blankets, and the air tasted of ice. Silver Hollow seemed perfect, a place untouched by time. The harsh winter and the haunting atmosphere would make for stunning photographs. Rebecca could already see the composition, the depth in the white mist, the snow-covered trees. But as she stood there, ready to begin her work, something felt off. The townsfolk were friendly enough, but their smiles were tight. They didn't meet her eyes, and whenever she asked about the frozen lament, the town's old legend, their faces would go pale, their voices would falter. Some would change the subject abruptly, while others would give her a soft, nervous smile. Rebecca frowned. "Just an old story," they would say. "Nothing to worry about." But Rebecca was used to brushing off strange tales. She had heard plenty in her travels, each one more bizarre than the last. Legends didn't frighten her, or at least that's what she told herself. That first night, Rebecca settled into her cabin, trying to shake off the oddness that clung to the air. But sleep never came. The wind howled outside, and the snow slapped against the windows with a force that seemed unnatural, almost as though it were trying to get inside. She tried to distract herself with her work, but then she saw it. A photograph she had taken earlier that day. The snow, the trees, everything was as it should be, until she looked closely at the edge of the frame. There, standing in the shadow of a large pine tree, was a figure. Tall, impossibly thin. Her heartbeat quickened. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was real. The figure stood still, motionless, as if it were waiting for something. The strangest thing was its face. There was none. Just an empty, hollow darkness, where a face should have been. She blinked, hoping it would disappear. But when she zoomed in on the image, it was still there. No. A chill ran down her spine. She quickly closed the camera, shoving it into her bag. But just as she did, she heard it. A low, mournful wail. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. It was distant at first, like the wind itself crying out in sorrow. But then the wail grew louder, closer. Her mind raced. Was it an animal? No, it sounded far too human. Something else. Something darker. The wail echoed again, closer, closer. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door handle, but she couldn't bring herself to open it. What if something was out there? What if it was waiting for her to step outside? The next morning, Rebecca pushed the unease aside. She had a job to do. There was no place for fear. So she gathered her camera gear and set out toward the forest. She didn't expect anything unusual. Just trees, snow, and more photographs to take. But as she passed Mrs. Graham's cabin on the way out, the elderly woman was standing by the window, watching her with wide, fearful eyes. "Don't go into the woods, dear." Mrs. Graham's voice cracked. Rebecca gave a slight chuckle, but it died in her throat when she saw the old woman's trembling hands. Mrs. Graham wasn't joking. She was terrified. "The snow," Mrs. Graham whispered, barely audible above the wind. "It's not just snow. It remembers what's been lost. And the lament. It'll come for you if you wander too far." Rebecca's stomach turned. She forced a smile. "I'll be fine," she said, even as her heart rate sped up. "It's just a story." But the moment she stepped away, she felt the weight of the warning pressing against her. The forest was eerily still. Too still. The snow piled high, and not a single animal stirred. No birds, no rustling of branches. The quiet was oppressive. Rebecca's camera clicked as she snapped a few pictures, the sound sharp in the stillness. But with each step deeper into the trees, the unease grew heavier. She felt watched, like something was lurking just out of sight. She paused, looking over her shoulder, her breath quickening. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned back to the path. And then she heard it, a low, guttural sound, like a breath being drawn from the depths of a nightmare. It was too close, far too close. Rebecca whipped around, And there, in the mist of the forest, stood a figure. Tall, thin, its limbs twisted unnaturally, and its head, its face, was nothing but a black void. Her heart froze. Her throat tightened. It was real. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, motionless, like a shadow made of snow. Rebecca took a slow, trembling step back, her breath ragged. The wail echoed in her ears, growing louder. Her camera, she didn't know why, rose to her hands. She snapped a photo. The flash illuminated the figure for a split second. It was gone, vanished. Rebecca turned and ran. Her boots slipped in the snow, her breath coming in gasps, her pulse a frantic drumbeat in her ears. The wail followed her, growing closer, faster. Don't look back, don't look back. But it was too late. She couldn't stop herself. She glanced behind her. Nothing. Her heart hammered in her chest. She stumbled through the snow, breathless, her legs aching, every step harder than the last. And then, she made it out of the woods. She collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. The snow fell gently around her, the wail distant now, like it had never been there at all. But Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling. Something was still watching her. When she finally gathered the strength to stand, she turned around to look back at the woods. She half expected to see the figure standing just beyond the tree line staring at her. But there was nothing. She let out a long breath of relief. That night, Rebecca sat in front of the fire, staring at the photograph she had taken. The figure was still there. Her fingers trembled as she held the photo in her hands, and that's when she saw it. The figure was closer this time. Her blood ran cold. Rebecca thought she had left it behind, thought it was over. But as the wail started again, closer now, almost right outside the cabin, she knew. It wasn't over. She didn't wait another moment. Grabbing her bags, she dashed for the door, but the wail, that terrible, sorrowful wail, followed her, echoing in the snow. Rebecca's chest tightened. It was real. She glanced over her shoulder, and in that brief moment, she saw them. Figures, tall and thin, their hollow eyes staring out of the darkness, watching her. Her scream caught in her throat as the figures began to move closer, their limbs stretching unnaturally as they closed the distance. Her breath hitched. It wasn't just a story. It was real. It had always been real.